Good day, everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn event entitled The Best Treated Minority in the World, Genealogy avec Cliché. My name is Lorraine O'Donnell. I'm Research Associate with the Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network, QUESCREN, and Affiliate Assistant Professor at Concordia University. I'll be your moderator today. Before continuing, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform today, Concordia is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within Montreal. And I did want you to know that at QUESCREN, we take this commitment seriously, and we're actively working on improving our relationships with Indigenous communities, especially ones that speak English within Quebec. This event is made possible through the financial support of the Secretariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise of the Quebec government. So I now have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Patrick Donovan is a research associate for QUESCREN and has worked on QUESCREN projects since 2010. His doctoral research in history at Université Laval deals with evolution of ethno-religious boundaries within charitable networks for Quebec City's English speakers. Patrick has a master's degree in heritage preservation from Université Montréal, and he played an instrumental role in the restoration establishment of the beautiful Morin Center, an English language cultural center and heritage site in Quebec City. So Patrick, I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. The phrase best treated minority in the world has typically been used to describe Quebec's English-speaking population. And if you're like me, it's a phrase that raises lots of questions. When did it start being used? How has its use changed over the years? How did people back up this claim, and how did they counter this claim? And finally, are English-speaking Quebecers really the world's best treated minority? These are some of the questions I'll be addressing today. I'll begin by explaining the context of the study, then go into the methodology. The bulk of the presentation will be a historical overview of how the phrase has been used since the 1800s, and I'll end with a bit of discourse analysis, not too much. This talk presents initial findings of some research I did toward a 15-20-page QUESCREN working paper that'll be published in March. So in other words, it's not a large research project or a thesis, it's a short exploratory paper. If you want to see other research papers produced by QUESCREN, you can go to quescren.ca and under resources, click on QUESCREN documents. So this brings me to the methodology. Now, given the time constraints, it's a short research paper. I limited my sources to a sample of newspaper articles published in Quebec. I initially searched the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec's digitized collection of Quebec magazines and newspapers. Now, this is a full text searchable database, which includes over 700 French language newspapers, over 80 English papers, and some in other languages, all of them printed in Quebec and dating back to the 1700s. I went by keyword search, so I used the phrases best treated minority, minorité la mieux traitée, a few synonymous phrases like most favored, most privileged, most spoiled, and I then gathered a sample of up to a dozen articles per decade in each language, excluding duplicates or similar articles from similar dates. There were fewer articles in the decades before 1960, and this is partly due to the poor quality of the optical character recognition for older newspapers, which were often digitized earlier at lower resolutions and using secondary, lower quality microfiche sources. So they're digitizations of digitizations. So given this, it's hard to draw broad conclusions on how prevalent the phrase was before the 1960s using these sources. Although this search yielded a workable sample in French, there were very few English language results. The English papers in BANQ's collection are mostly pre-1920s, and there were no pre-1920 results in English. Most of the English language results came from the Sherbrooke record, but I felt a workable sample in English needed to go beyond Sherbrooke. So given this limitation, I supplemented my sample with results from the Proquest Montreal Gazette collections, which is a fantastic full-text searchable database with excellent OCR going back to 1857. And that's why I'm confident showing you this slide, which shows that the phrase, how often the best treated minority phrase comes up in the Gazette. And you'll see, it mostly comes up in the late 80s and 1990s, and there's no mention before 1959. In the end, my sample consisted of 157 articles in English, 101 articles in French. So I'm working from a small sample, but somewhat fairly representative of changes over time. Of course, there are limitations to this methodology. It's limited to periodicals. I could have gone into the archives of the National Assembly, the political platforms of different parties, the writings of prominent political figures. Somebody brought up recently, Robert Talbot brought up F.R. Scott's diaries, which have a lot of interesting stuff. But I kept it to newspapers. There's also the fact that some newspapers are not digitized for any meaningful period. Most notably, I'd say the Journal de Montréal, which is the best-selling paper in Quebec and likely has a lot of the use of the phrase best treated minority. Other papers like the Montreal Star and in there, the Suburban. So the sample is limited to what I could find. But it does have a broad range of stuff. And finally, the methodology does not capture all quasi-synonymous word choices that may have been dominant in other periods or contexts. So I did look for most spoiled, most favored, but I may have forgotten some. So what do you do when you have all these articles? Well, I compile them into a spreadsheet using the following analytical framework, which would allow me to sort of gauge broad themes and trends for different periods. And I'm doing a genealogy of the phrase. Now, genealogy, this is a term used by Nietzsche, Foucault, endlessly defined and debated what that exactly means. I'm using it here in a rather loose, sort of broad sense to mean trying to assess how the past shaped the present, which is not always in a linear, clear way. And in the case of English-speaking Quebec, we're talking about a past where there was a hegemonic English-speaking ruling class from the 1760s to the mid-1800s, whose legacy did not disappear overnight. There was a desire to anglicize the French in Canada. And although the overwhelming majority of English speakers in Quebec today are not descendants of this ruling class and also speak French, these things leave traces. Some people only see the traces to the exclusion of everything else. Others try to deny the traces. But one of the legacies of these traces we have to reckon with is this best treated minority phrase. So let's begin. Let's go back in time. The earliest quote I found was from 1886 in the Catholic ultramontane paper, La Vérité. And the first thing you'll notice about these two quotes, they talk about the best treated minority being la minorité protestante dans notre province. So it depicts the minority in religious terms, not linguistic ones. And as this graph shows, this was generally the case before 1920. And this is consistent with what I found when doing research on the 19th century for my thesis. Irish Catholics, English-speaking Protestants had a separate set of institutions and a separate sense of identity. And many Francophones recognize this, though those boundaries became less important over time and some of those institutions ended up merging. Next question, why were they considered best treated? Well, the first quote is from 1886. There's some resonance there. The Canadian Pacific Railway was completed in 1886. That's a year after Louis Riel was hanged. English speakers want the West to be English, which until then was largely Indigenous, Métis, Francophone. And Montreal at the time is the largest city and the economic powerhouse in Canada. There's a disproportionate number of English speakers, particularly Protestants, among the Montreal elite and among, the country's elite. So Francophones are feeling increasingly shortchanged by the promises of Confederation, that they're not being treated as fairly as they're treating English speakers in Quebec, or that's how they put it. And the issue that comes up most often in the pre-1960 sample is the issue around schools. Protestants, and to a lesser extent, Irish Catholics, had their own schools in Quebec. The Protestant minority in Quebec controlled its school boards, its schools, its curriculum. But this was not the case for Francophones outside Quebec necessarily. And I won't go into the Manitoba school questions, Regulation 17 in Ontario, all kinds of measures meant to restrict access to French language education outside Quebec. But this had a lot of resonance in Quebec. And here we see a photo of Ontario school children protesting in 1916, saying, we want British fair play, our parents pay school taxes too. They want to have access to French language schooling to the same degree that Anglophones did in Quebec. English speakers in Quebec recognized this disparity at the time. They did not push back, and that's what's interesting for this period. There's no pushback against the best treated minority phrase, as would happen later. In fact, a lot of times they reinforced it. Here we have quotes from a Montreal alderman and a Liberal MNA. One of them, the Liberal MNA saying, I will resign my seat if someone can show me a place where the minority is treated with such fairness as Anglophones are in Quebec. As Robert Talbot pointed out in his research, a lot of these people also worried that attempts in the rest of Canada to assimilate Francophones could have had a backlash with the English-speaking minority in Quebec as well. So that could be partly where they're coming from, but hopefully it's also a sense of a recognition of the disparities. The best treated minority phrase was also used by people at the top. Every premier from 1920 to 1959 used this quote. I have 7 articles from different years where Duplessis says this same sentence. Nulle part au monde les minorités ne sont aussi bien traitées que dans cette province. And he's not talking only about the Protestant minority, but all minorities, which is an interesting quote if you're familiar with the Roncarelli affair, but I digress. Once, after Duplessis said this, the leader of the Liberal opposition, George Marler, an Anglophone Protestant, stood up, said, yes, I'm a Protestant. Yes, I agree. We really are fairly treated in Quebec. So what I'm saying is that there's practically no opposition to this phrase before the 60s. The only opposition I found was from 2 anti-clerical Francophone intellectuals who were pushing for secular schools. But that's 2 articles out of nearly 50. No opposition from English speakers. So if the media is to be believed, there seemed to be a broad consensus across linguistic, religious, and political lines that Quebec was exemplary in its treatment of minorities. So now we fast forward to the 1960s, which is a bit of a bizarre, counterintuitive sideshow in our chronology. Up until this point, nobody is saying that Francophones are the best treated minority. But in the 60s, nearly 3/4 of the quotes in my sample make this claim. Stranger still, they're being made by the leader and friends of the burgeoning Rassemblement pour l'Indépendance Nationale, the precursor to the Parti Québécois. Marcel Chaput was the president of the RIN, and at every speech, he would repeat the sentence. Il est vrai que les Canadiens français forment la minorité la mieux traitée au monde. Mais là n'est pas la question. Nous ne voulons pas être une minorité, nous voulons être une majorité dans notre propre pays. So, it's true that Francophones are the best treated minority, but we don't want to be a minority, we want to be a majority in our own country. Predictably, now this line of thought did not go down well among everybody within the sovereignist movement. And there's quotes, Chaput, c'est l'homme qui pue l'anglo-canadien. Why are we asking for independence if we're so well treated? I know, and then they were saying, the real best treated minority is the English speaking minority. And there's also quotes from Brian Mulroney, which is ridiculing Chaput's use of the best treated minority phrase in the 1960s. This phrase is no longer used today by the sovereignists. But there are a few examples beyond the 60s of Francophone sovereignists arguing that they themselves are the best treated minority. And these come mostly from a few mostly disappointed sovereignists, like, for instance, political scientist Gérard Bergeron. The argument goes, independence requires courage. Quebecers are stuck in a perpetual adolescence. They're too pampered, they're too well treated to be courageous and to vote for independence. And you see this line in a lot of cultural productions, most notably Denis Arcand's movie Le Confort et l'Indifférence. So to sum it up, there are people arguing that francophones are the best treated minority, but interestingly, most of them are francophones themselves. In addition to the growth of the sovereignist movement, the 1960s is also associated with the Quiet Revolution. So there's secularization, the growth of a very strong francophone-led state. And then in the 1970s, language laws recognized French as the only language in Quebec and begin restricting access to English schools. So the power balance is shifting. When the president of the Quebec Association of Protestant School Boards appeared before a Parliamentary Commission on Education in the 70s, he was essentially told English speakers needed to learn to live like a minority. PQ Deputy Claude Charon said English speakers were the best treated minority in the world, but that the francophone majority had made a mistake in allowing Protestants to create their own system. Il faudra vous habituer à l'avenir à ne pas prendre des privilèges comme des droits. In other words, the argument is no longer being used to depict francophones as fair-minded or push for more rights for francophones outside Quebec, but begins to be used to restrict rights for anglophones within Quebec, who are, depicted as being spoiled, as having too many rights. Despite this gradual change of tone among some people using the phrase, the English language press is not pushing back against the best treated minority argument. In the 70s, we have René Lévesque saying it, but we also have Pierre Elliott Trudeau using it, a United Church minister in Lennoxville. The coordinator of external affairs from McGill University says, yes, Anglophones are the best treated minorities. This is a great place to come study. A prominent English-speaking union leader. All these people reiterate that English speakers are the best treated minority. There's still no opposition to the phrase in the press. The 1980s are a turning point. Politicians and Francophone columnists are still calling English speakers the best treated minority, but English speakers are now saying they're sick of it. It's referred to as an old refrain, a worn cliche, a form of finger-wagging condescension. Gaspésian community leader Howard Davidson considered its repeated use patronizing, adding that it made him think of sewage that must be treated in order to remove the dangerous impurities. Rita Legault, who back then was writing for the Sherbrooke Record, wrote, if I hear that inane comment once more, I will scream. There's a growing irritation. And there are many different kinds of articles in the English language press addressing this phrase. Long op-eds by people like Julius Gray trying to counter the best treated minority phrase with clear, sort of irrational arguments. More sarcastic pieces by Don McPherson about the most taxed minority in the world being served with its own taxes. There were, these below the belt ad hominem attacks that, Howard Galganovish, that could be qualified as Quebec bashing. So it ran the gamut, but the Gazette also had a resident English speaking sovereignist columnist, Ed Banty, who reminded readers that they were the best treated minority. And this usually generated lots of letters to the editor. So why this sudden shift? Why had the phrase, which had been used and embraced by English speakers themselves in the past, suddenly become so unbearable? For one, it was becoming more difficult to make the case that English speakers were better treated than Francophones outside Quebec, particularly with regard to primary and secondary schools, which had long been the backbone of the argument. Bill 101, as you know, restricted access to English schools in Quebec. The student population in the English language sector declined by 61% from the 1970s to now. So there's a big decline. And conversely, Section 23 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982 paved the way for more French language schools outside Quebec and school boards controlled by Francophone communities themselves. And you see skyrocketing of enrollment in French schools outside Quebec, and that excludes immersion schools, which also grew in number since the 80s. A 2012 study argued that other provinces spend 10 times as much as Quebec per capita on the official language minority sector. But even as early as 1983, it was clear these changes were on the horizon. We have Liberal MNA Reid Scowen here saying, the Quebec government is going to have to be careful when they say that English speakers are the best treated minority in Canada. The landscape is changing. There have also been changes in the relative socioeconomic conditions of French and English speakers in Quebec. While you could argue for the rich Anglo stereotype in the 60s to a certain extent, the median and average incomes of English-speaking Quebecers is now lower than that of Francophones. Unemployment rates are higher. So that's changed, and that comes up also in some of the articles. But the most common argument from English speakers against this best treated minority is that they built their own institutions that serve the population as a whole, and the existence of these institutions is not due to the generosity of the Francophone majority. English speakers pay taxes and deserve a share of public funding. Sure, say some, but some people say English speakers receive more than their share, and a lot of the arguments reinforcing this best treated minority phrase will point to, they no longer point to primary, secondary schools, but they'll point to big universities like McGill, large healthcare institutions. And then we get into numbers, per capita spending. You can play with the numbers to make whatever case you're making, and both sides of the argument have. While some things had changed on the ground for English speakers who felt increasingly like a fragile minority and whose, the socioeconomic indicators had declined, the fact remained that French speakers are a tiny minority on the North American scale, one that feels fragile, and this continued to be brought up to support the best treated minority argument. In some cases, such as this quote, Anglophones, even though they're bilingual in Quebec, are seen as part of this larger majority, not really a minority, but the minority in quotes, la plus gâtée au monde. The growing irritation expressed by English speakers at the best treated minority argument did not initially stop Quebec premiers and politicians from using it, particularly those of a nationalist bent. If you were wondering, this caricature depicts Diefenbaker and Jacques Parizeau. Granted, perhaps not the best depictions, and I should add that it is highly unlikely Diefenbaker ever said this, and I found no evidence of Parizeau ever using the best treated minority quote. However, many other Quebec premiers have. And here's a list, with Bernard Landry coming up most often in my sample. And you'll notice these are mostly nationalist premiers, and that the term fell out of favor for a long time after Landry as linguistic tensions died down in the last 20 years. But linguistic tensions seem to be coming back, unfortunately. And the tension-inducing phrase has also come back. Legault used it recently, and it's also been used by Jean-François Lisée, Yves-François Blanchette, Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois in recent years. So how did the phrase go from a widespread use that bridged political and linguistic divides to a much narrower use by Quebec nationalists and what we could call les chevaliers de la langue française? Well, here's a possible turning point. In 1990, during a Bill 101 sign laws kerfuffle, PQ-MMA Jacques Brassard brought forth a three-part motion to denounce anti-French sentiment in Canada, stand up for the notwithstanding clause, and to reiterate the National Assembly's conviction that the Anglophone minority in Quebec is by far the best treated minority in Canada. The motion was debated and revised over the following week. The Liberals wanted to soften the language about the best treated minority. The PQ is saying, we need to claim it. We need to say that they're the best treated minority. They sont la minorité la mieux traitée au monde. And in the end, the ruling Liberals softened the language to reach this type of compromise that Bourassa excelled at. So rather than claiming that the minority was the best treated, the Liberals proposed that the Assembly reiterates its commitment to act in such a way that its English-speaking community, which can be considered the best treated minority, continues to be treated with justice and equity. The motion was adopted, but it drew jeers in the press, it drew lots of debates in the press, and may have pushed the best treated minority phrase more and more into the nationalist camp. In the interest of keeping time, I won't dwell on the other best treated minorities that come up in my sample, but suffice it to say that my press sample does refer to other potential candidates. Other nations have called their minorities the best treated in the world. There's certainly a case to be made for the first 5, less so for the following 4, and definitely for the last one, men in the West. So now that we've gone through the history, I'll end with a bit of discourse analysis, looking more closely at the phrase itself. And I won't go too much into detail here. I'll start with 3 observations about the phrase that strike me as problematic just in a general sense. This is clearly a hyperbolic phrase, best treated minority in the world. In the world is objectively difficult to measure given the number of minorities on the planet. What are the metrics? What weight do you give to each of these metrics? And then there are all these external factors that are unrelated to a minority's treatment by the majority that can skew the different metrics. For instance, the relative demographic weight, the global use of the language, the historic circumstances of privilege, colonial histories and so on. So it's not a statement grounded in fact or sort of scientific basis. It's hyperbole, and hyperbole can be a barrier to nuanced discussions that foster vivre ensemble. Second point, it's a phrase that carries a certain denial of agency. Best treated, it's in the passive voice, and it's much more passive than terms like privileged or well off. It constructs the situation of the minority as resting solely or primarily on its treatment by the majority, suggesting a kind of lack of the agency on behalf of the minority, suggesting that actions by the minority are not really a factor in determining its socioeconomic condition. Rather, the condition of the minority is due to decisions made by the majority. Elizabeth Spire in the Gazette wrote, "A minority is not there to be treated in any fashion, whether best treated or worst treated. A minority either has rights in law or it is in the category of second-class citizen, that is to say, non-citizen." Such a choice of words, best treated minority, might make sense in a colonial context where minorities have less agency. But in a democratic society like Quebec, where English speakers not only have a stake and participate in provincial governance, but are also part of the linguistic majority as a federal level, it's strange. And finally, whataboutism. Whataboutism, also called the tu quoque logical fallacy, is a way of deflecting criticism or reversing an accusation by arguing that an opponent is guilty of an offense just as bad or worse than what the original party was accused of doing. For instance, Americans accuse China of mistreating Tibet, and China will respond by saying, well, what about the lynching of Black people? This does not address the mistreatment of people in Tibet, for instance. So the best treated minority argument can be used and occurs in our sample as a form of whataboutism at times. A grievance is brought up by English speakers or relating to English speakers, and the response is to say, well, what about French-speaking minorities outside Quebec? They face greater injustice. So it does not address the grievance, but deflects it and diminishes it by raising the grievances of another group. And I'll end with some general comments on the phrase's use. Now, at its best, the phrase is used, I think, to reflect positively on the fair-mindedness of the majority, and ideally to reinforce that fair-mindedness. At its best, the phrase's aim is to encourage people outside Quebec to show the same fair play towards minorities as those in Quebec. And I think that's mostly how it was used before 1960. At its worst, it's used by the majority to shut down grievances by a minority by depicting it as spoiled and privileged. Sometimes it's very clear how the phrase is being used, especially when you use words like most spoiled minority, as Yves-François Blanchette recently said. If you're spoiled, you're getting more than you deserve, and you're expected to be quiet and not raise too many alarms. But sometimes it's not as clear. It may be intended benevolently, but recent history has shown that English speakers are more likely to take it otherwise. We've seen other types of uses, such as Marcel Chaput's and the sarcastic uses made in the press, but I think this sums up the two poles in our spectrum. And that brings my presentation to an end, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. What an interesting talk. I see a couple of questions in the chat already, and I encourage those who are here to add more. So Patrick André Mater has written, are linguistic tensions coming back in Quebec? Why and how?
it feels to me like linguistic tensions are coming back, and I think it relates mostly to Bill 96 and Bill 21. That's what I've observed in recent years, and I think it seems, unfortunately, linguistic tensions are on the resurgence.
Here's another question from Susan O'Donnell. Very interesting presentation. I was interested when you showed the chart showing Protestants as the targeted community. Are there still religious overtones to this phrase?
I haven't found any religious overtones beyond the 1960s and probably beyond the 1950s. It seems at one point, I mean, there are still religious divisions in Quebec to a certain extent, but they're very mild. So I think, you know, after the 1960s, it sort of becomes the English-speaking community.
So I'm just going to add to that point and that question. Do you see any link between that and the Bill 21 situation, which is about religion? You know, have you seen any particular uses of the phrase in that context?
I have not seen any uses of the phrase with regard to Bill 21, but my sample ended around 2019. So that's before all of this blew up. Though generally English speakers tend to be less favorable towards Bill 21 than Francophone majority. So that's where the tension lies.
Thank you. Joe Graham would like to speak to the religious overtone question.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I think that the thing that we have to be attentive to is the history of Quebec, going right back to its beginning. And from there, what was happening in France and what's still happening in France and Quebec. And that is a cultural inheritance from the Catholic majority in France that maintains in Quebec today in homogenizing, insisting in homogenization in the way people think. And that is where the religious overtones come from. It's nothing to do with God. It's something to do with standardization and homogenization. Everyone has to be the same, particularly in France and Quebec. I can back that up with more information, but I'll try to stop there and let you go with that.
Thank you. Nothing like a bit of controversy over our sandwiches. Here's a question from Hugh Maynard. What should the English-speaking community respond to the best treated statement when it gets floated from time to time? And his point is in the optic of not further inflaming linguistic tensions.
Well, I think the best way to respond is to respond with evidence to the contrary, showing that, first of all, it's hard to measure, and second of all, there's a decline, a socioeconomic decline among English-speaking Quebec. There is a decline in terms of access to English language schools relative to Francophones outside Quebec. I think a lot of the arguments that were being made, the idea that Anglophones did build their own institutions, funded these institutions, they pay taxes and deserve a fair share of the taxes to support these institutions. Now, again, the argument that's often made against that is that Anglophones get more than their fair share. McGill gets a lot of, more money relative to the size of the English-speaking minority. But, McGill, the Montreal McGill University Hospital, these are institutions that not only serve the English-speaking minority, these are big sort of institutions that serve the population as a whole. And in the case of McGill, a lot of international students. So I think if you respond with facts, that's probably the best way.
Ruby Pratka asked another question. I'm also curious to know why you're focusing on this topic now and its importance in the current context. I think you addressed this a little when you were answering Patrick André.
And why I am focusing on this now, I think it was a personal interest to me to find out where this phrase come from as a historian. So that's why I initially focused on it, but I do think it has relevance because it is a recurring motif in the public discourse, and I don't think it helps to build a healthy vivre ensemble, especially not since the 1980s. So I think, it's worth getting the message out there that this is not the best way to approach discussions with the English-speaking community. It's a phrase that has backfired a lot. And why has it backfired? So I think bringing that up does have some use.
The questions keep coming, Patrick. Here's one from Melanie Carriage. She writes, as an Anglo who grew up here since the 60s and learned French and tried to integrate into the larger Francophone culture, I still feel guilty about the actions of Anglos from the past. Anyone else feel this way? What to do about it? On the other hand, the best minority phrase irritates me. And she just adds, I'm glad to have more info on its history. So I don't know if you have comments on that question. So the heart of it is, anyone else feel guilty about the actions of Anglos from the past and what to do about it? People are also, of course, welcome to reply to Melanie in the comments. Do you have anything to say there, Patrick?
Well, I mean, I don't feel personally guilty about actions in the past, but I think if you look at history, there are certainly periods in the past where English speakers did not react in the best ways. We can look at, the burning of the Parliament, for instance, as one example, and did not always show justice towards the Francophone minorities and contributed to its decline. The same goes towards relations towards Indigenous people. So there are problematic issues in the past. The question is what to do about these. I think being aware of them is a good first step towards ensuring that history does not repeat itself anyway.
Thank you, Patrick. And I would like to add, Melanie, just to enter that particular debate. We are trying at QUESCREN to present a more nuanced and balanced historical record, including through our People's History Project, which I presented last month in this forum. And I do think, actually, I'm biased as a historian, but I do believe that being truthful about the past, including what Patrick just mentioned, where there was inequitable treatment by the English minority of the Francophone majority, is part of the answer. It's addressing, honestly and in a nuanced and true sense what went on. Robert Talbot writes, any sense, Patrick, of how or whether this cliché is being used by Canadians outside of Quebec? Is it your impression that the rest of Canada is helping to reinforce this stereotype, or is it more benign in this debate?
I did a search in the Proquest Canadian, the press outside Quebec, looking at the Globe and Mail and other sources. It doesn't appear very much outside of Quebec. I got very few hits. It's not really used by Anglophones outside Quebec, and all the hits I got from the Globe and Mail related to Quebec. So I have a feeling that, when you're talking about the rest of Canada, they're not really using this phrase. And there's very, I didn't come across any instance where Anglophones refer to Francophones as the best treated minority, or very few. And those were mostly in angry letters to the editors in the 1980s. But
so the Globe ones were people calling English-speaking Quebecers best treated minority? They were adding on.
No, the Globe ones were reporting on the situation in Quebec.
I see.
Yeah. So in English, I haven't seen much use of this phrase by English Canadians. Now you probably know more than I do about this. You've done a lot of research on the whole bon ententisme in the 1920s and 30s. But
that comment is aimed at Robert Talbot.
Yes, Robert Talbot.
Our colleague and friend. Andrew Palucci writes, given that stats and data can be manipulated to fit certain narratives, how can we convince Francophone majority that issues impacting the English-speaking community are real and merit attention?
That's the $1 million question. I don't know. I mean, I think you can keep bringing up the stats, and some people, will bring up stats of their own, and there is a kind of dialogue des sourds, as they say, going on. People will bring up mother tongue stats, other people will bring up FOLS stats that contradict them. I think it's hard, but I think you need to keep making the point, using the evidence you have, and hopefully it'll break through to some people. I think some people don't want to hear it on either side.
William,
old stereotypes die hard.
Yeah. William Flock writes, did the media sources include the Gleaner from Huntingdon? The editor, publisher at the turn of the 20th century, Robert Seller, wrote a book entitled The Tragedy of Quebec, the Expulsion of its Protestant Farmers, which was a controversial polemic at the time and hasn't necessarily aged well. I wouldn't be surprised to find that the Gleaner under Seller's stewardship could have presented countercurrent for other participants in the public discourse at the time.
The sources did not include the Gleaner. I don't believe it's been digitized by BANQ. Hugh Maynard might know more about that since he is currently involved with the Gleaner and the archives.
It will be shortly.
It will be shortly. So in the future, I could update this research. But however, one of the articles I came up with from 1900 was a response to Robert Seller. Robert Seller was pushing for secular schools in Quebec. He was against the whole Catholic school system. So he was pushing for sort of unified secular schools. And one of the responses was to Robert Seller from a Catholic paper saying this is a terrible idea. It's not good for national unity. And, this is what they're doing to francophones in Manitoba. And here, Protestants are the best treated minority and you should be happy. So there was some reaction to Seller, but I did not get any actual direct quotes from Seller. But yeah, you're right. It would be interesting to look at Robert Seller, who was, who had some interesting things to say in the early 20th century.
Joseph Graham, who doesn't shy away from controversy at all, is now asking, do you feel that financing from the Secretariat has a pacifying effect on our community, and should it? I think I'm not sure what should it means, but I assume he means should it have a pacifying effect? Do you want to weigh in on that one?
Pacifying effect. Well, that's well, it definitely has a beneficial effect. We're certainly grateful to be getting financing from the Secretariat. Does it have a pacifying effect? I would hope it wouldn't prevent us from shying away from controversy. I don't feel like I've been silenced or pacified by financing from the Secretariat. How do you feel, Lorraine?
Well,
send that one right back to you.
Yeah, and I won't go into detail, but just to say, in our case at Concordia, we are getting funding not only to shine the light on other people's research, which covers every angle of topics. Therefore, visit our bibliography, sign up for a newsletter, but also we ourselves are doing research. I mean, I hardly see this as a pacified presentation, but I think I'll have to leave it at that. People are welcome, of course, to write things in the comments. Richard Boris writes, Prime Minister Legault said about the cap on English CEGEPs in June 21. Bill 96 is clear. Anglophones represent 8% of Quebec, and they will get 8% of new spots in the future. In other words, in the CEGEPs. That's from the Montreal Gazette. Patrick, there may be a shift to use numerous, I think that's COSIS. Anglos will only get support in line with their demography in Quebec.
Yeah, that's what some people are pushing for. Mostly, mostly the hardline kind of défenseurs de la langue française. I think it's unfortunate because these institutions go beyond serving just the English-speaking minority, and that should be acknowledged.
Susan wrote, regarding the use of this theme outside of Quebec, I haven't heard the phrase used here in New Brunswick, but recently there was a situation where the Francophone Rights Organization in New Brunswick, the SANB, tried to align with an Anglophone rights organization in Quebec on a specific rights issue, and Francophone New Brunswickers were very critical of this. The organization SANB took a lot of flack. Andrew,
Yeah, I think this is the SANB who tried to align with the QCGN over the schools issue.
Yeah, Andrew, maybe you can type something in the chat there to give a bit more information. Someone made the comment, Melanie, there's no clear definition of Anglophone in response to Richard Boris. So that's a very good point, Melanie. That defining Anglophone is a science in itself. Robert Talbot asks, did you come across examples of Francophones arguing against the cliché or trying to debunk myths about the English-speaking community more generally? Sometimes confronting misperceptions about a minority is most effective if it comes from members of the majority themselves. That's a great point, Robert.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of examples in the press, including in the Devoir and La Presse, of Francophones saying that this type of phrase should not be used and for this and this reason, for sure. And it goes back, I mean, as I said, before the 1960s, the only opposition to the phrase came from two anti-clerical writers, one Jean-Charles Hervé and the other one Télésphore Damien Bouchard, who was president of Hydro-Québec, but also a prominent anti-clerical politician. And these people were saying it doesn't mean that the minority is not responding to it, that they agree with it. Télésphore Damien Bouchard was saying because in Quebec, the Jewish minority and the agnostic atheist minority is not as well served as they are in the rest of Canada, because in the rest of Canada they have access to secular schools. So there has been a sort of wide range of discourse among Francophones. And even among the Anglophones, there was, as I mentioned, Ed Banty, who was sort of the Anglophone sovereignist, sort of reinforcing the English-speaking minority. So it's not clearly divided between English and French. There are some people arguing either side, both sides in both language groups. Sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent there. But
it's good to know. Robert had his hand up and then put it down. Robert, I can see you. So did you want to speak? You can nod either way.
Yeah, just quickly. Yeah, I think Patrick he answered the question I had, but I guess some of those, those earlier examples of, I guess, like positive examples of Francophones or Anglophones actually using this cliche, but for the purposes of, hey, the minority in Quebec is well treated, so let's treat the minorities elsewhere in Canada more positively. But it's still a use of the concept. But you mentioned examples too of where Francophones have contributing to the discourse have said, actually this isn't true. So it's interesting to hear about that. Thanks. Terrific presentation, by the way. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Robert. There's one last question, and then Patrick will have to wrap up. So this comes from Marie Moliner. Where in Quebec history is there a use or reference to it? And this is in quotes, an injury to one is an injury to all. In other words, I guess that's a way in to countering concerns about negative treatment of minorities. So I wanted to thank everybody for attending today's event. So thank you again for being here, and we wish you all a great day. See you next time.